Hi. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Pythagoras today. See, I've been looking a little more into Pythagoras' life and what little we know about it. And, coming from a place of sphere and synergetics and spherical being, I am particularly tuned into listening for whatever there is to be said about maybe whatever Pythagoras and his people believed or thought or knew about geometry. And whoever knows my channel stuff, my videos, my work here, knows that I have a whole lot to say about reanimation of geometry, a becoming aware of the principles at play within the fractal forest of space-time, which is something we can very well learn about and find out about if we tune into Synergetics. And with that in the back of my mind, listening to Pythagoras' story, there is a very long span of time. I'm listening to a book about Pythagoras through time, looking at the things people said about them, and it took a very long while until the Middle Ages before, I think, as far as I noticed, before there was much talk about cubes in there. And whoever knows what I'm doing knows that I'm very outspoken about the nonsensical nature of the abstractions of geometry that we've learned, speaking of static space and solids and polyhedra as static and, again, solid constructs. Being blissfully unaware of the nature of shape and the shape of nature, and of, most importantly, the fact that shape is coming from structure, and structure is triangle, and triangle is structure. And I've been very often trying to communicate some of these things, in particular the shortcomings of the box mind, with these videos, through these videos. And yeah, now I've done a long while back, I've done a video on Pythagoras, and in particular Pythagoras' Tetractys, which is the model that Pythagoras is using according to tradition to teach people about the cosmos. And as far as it's recounted, the Tetractys is pretty much this. It's a set of 10 spheres. Don't mind the others yet. There's 10 spheres here in a triangle. So there's 1, then there's 2, then there's 3, and then there's 4. And in the mind of Pythagoras and his folks, I think it's pretty fair to say that they understood universe in terms of spheres, and began with spheres and what a sphere is, and I don't think they would have subscribed to the current ideas of and concepts of what a sphere is supposed to be. Maybe, but maybe not. And I don't think they would. Doesn't need to be perfect to be a sphere. But they would, Pythagoras and his folks would subscribe or ascribe a lot of meaning to number, arithmetics, and to shape and geometry, and to music, and more things. is those four is like wait which is the fourth? There's number or geometry. There's number, music, and one more. Go figure. Go look it up. But they would use a model of 10 pebbles, calculus, calc pebble. They would use 10 pebbles to explain and understand, comprehend some of the fundamental nature of universe. And the way it is translated to us through time and through the traditions and the books is they would take this shape, which they call the Tetractys, and they would say, well, there's one sphere, which they call the monad, which would be the one and all, you know, the whole, I suppose. And if I may throw in a little synergetics, unity is plural and at minimum two, which is to say even that one, the whole of it is not just this little sphere that we see here, as defined by at least its membrane, but it actually is the congruent sphere of universe that holds it. You know, so if we see a sphere here, it also defines a sphere around it as universe. So keep that in mind. It's all one, because the membrane we find in ourselves is not cutting us off, separating us out. It's actually binding us. It's a boundary binding our inside to our outside, meaning our whole self into oneness. So that's the monad here. And then they have the dyad, which is two, which between them have a line, make a line, which is the relationship between the two. Then we have three, and if we put those together we get a triangle like this, an eye. Okay, and when we go to the fourth row we have four spheres, and when we put those together we get the four eyes, which looks like this. Four spheres closest drawn. And this is the moment when the spheres turn in on themselves, because once again we have a membrane defined by the vertices, which are the hearts of these spheres. We could call these moons, and the hearts of these moons define 4 points. Between them is 6 lines of relationship being closest drawn. And these eyes, these triangle eyes, you know, I call this an eye because I can look through it, and we have the eye of the needle and so forth. There's good reason to call it that. Now the four eyes of this four eyes, they embody, manifest a membrane that binds again the inside of this four eyes to its outside. So this is a sphere in its own, the simplemost sphere of spheres. Well, and this would be where traditionally the transmission would end, especially in the way that it usually is transmitted to us nowadays. Is through the lens of the later abstracted geometry, the lifeless geometry. For lack of a better reference or word, let's just call it Platonic, even though I would say that Plato himself was probably a lot more familiar with what I'm speaking about here than we give him credit for. But in that way of transmitting this knowledge, when they speak of these things, they keep them in the exact place where all geometry is supposedly happening, which is the abstract, the mental level of, you know, where everything about geometry is really disembodied. It begins with a point which is of no dimension. It has no expanse. It has nothing to it, no weight, no nothing. It's really not there. And that's a different place to begin with than having a sphere, because a sphere again has a center of gravity which is brought into being by the membrane around it, where all the vertices on the membrane of however complex a sphere we're looking at, the vertices of these are approximately of the same distance to their center of gravity, their common heart. With that's a shift in realizing, well, geometry doesn't need to begin with nothing. It doesn't need to begin with abstraction before that. Abstraction means to have a river and take a little channel off of it. That's the abstraction originally. And in our way of what we're speaking about right now, I would say the river is universe and we are the river. But our thinking has been caught in this channel, this sightline, this abstraction from reality. And whenever we do think and plan and make geometry and all that, do geometry, there's the last step when we want to realize the house based on its plan. We need to round the calculations, because there's a transition between the abstraction back into reality, which has been round all along, and we've just been mindlessly squaring the circle for a while. So I won't go into all this stuff about how at the heart of the earth is fire. Now, fire is, in the understanding of these people, identical to the four eyes, which is why they called it pyramid too, which has to do with pyros, fire. And just yesterday I had a nice fire over there, which, anyways, I'm going too much on tangents sometimes. I won't on this time, sorry. But Pythagoras said apparently that there's fire at the heart of the earth, and yes, that is true, like in the sense of we have the molten heart of our kinship earth beneath our feet, within the earth, towards the center of it, as we have the molten heart of our solar system in the center of that sphere, and this heart of the galaxy, where in its very heart inside turns outside and black hole and all that stuff. So yeah, in that sense there's fire at the heart of the earth, but there's also a sense in which they already identified the so-called tetrahedron, what I call the four eyes, with fire, and likewise the so-called hexahedron, the so-called cube, which, to be very clear, in their thinking was triangulated. So we're speaking of a construct, we're not speaking of the non-struct that we're left with now, where the cube is just without triangulation, almost exclusively thought of. This cube, this hexahedron, has been identified in the same body of knowledge with the element earth. So when they say, and I don't have the model of that with me right now, and I chose not to because I was afraid I would go too deep into another very important trace of this storyline, which I cannot emphasize again and again enough and enough. But I chose not to because I know where I would go. So to return to this statement, there's fire at the heart of earth. If you've seen my other videos with the demonstrations, take Schrödinger's ketchup for instance, you know that indeed at the heart of the non-struct cube, to make it a construct, the change the transform of the non-structural shapeshifter, that is the cubic shape as it is mentally held in static space without triangulation, to realize it as a volume, as a structure, a construct in that case, is to put in the diagonals and the faces of the cube at least one set of 6, which is the edges of the four eyes. And I could show you the model. I have it not on me. I don't have it on me right now. I won't show you. It would take too long. I've done it. But to create a sound structure, a structurally sound body of space-time by means of triangulation and not means of micro-triangulation like glue in the corners or whatever, one needs to put in those triangles, and in that case there indeed if the cubic shape is earth and the four eyes is fire, and indeed there is a fire eyes, there's a four eyes at the heart of that construct to make it so. Long story short, I am just gonna go back to this bit because, see, the way they do translate it to us, they speak of these abstractions. They frame the knowledge within the abstractions of later geometry, where they say the point is the zero dimension, it's no weight, no nothing, nobody. The line is a line of division in later and further complicated senses, but it at least is a segment of this infinite straight line, they suppose, 1D. And then the eye, the triangle, they say is a polyhedron, meaning it's a many faces. In this case, yeah, anyways, we won't go down that same rabbit hole again. They say this is 2D, two-dimensional. They say it's this infinite plane that is really conceptualized, and in terms of accountability, they define it in squares rather than triangles, with all the subsequent trouble coming from that. But they say that this is a plane that goes to infinity, again, 2D, all that nonsense. And then when they do come to the four eyes, they call it the polyhedron, the tetrahedron, which is the same kind of abstraction, because it's created from those abstractions we had before, and now it's turned into a solid, which is also an abstraction, because clearly other constructs like the so-called cube, which only, or the so-called dodecahedron, those so-called platonic solids that are thrown together with the triangulated structures of space-time, they do not hold shape unless they are triangulated. And I'm not, I don't have them on me, but believe me, I can prove it to you, and I do it if you want me to, because I don't want to speak, from only that mental place. But to show all of it again now would take us too long. So I'm, pointing the fingers there without actually going there right now. Now, all of that, getting again through those levels of abstraction where we get to the solid, which is supposedly a volume of space, which is three-dimensional and thought of in the shape of that cube as the volume, with that being the unit volume defined, and not the four eyes, which would be the quantum volume of synergetics. We have lost all meaning in the transmission of the Tetractys because it has been translated into this abstraction, which it wouldn't need to be at all. And while I was listening to all that, I was playing around with these things that I've been growing over the recent time, these kinds of Baumel, as my friend called them, where these can show various beautiful things about synergetic relationships of space-time. I was contemplating that while I was listening to the whole thing with the Pythagorean tradition, and in my earlier videos on the topic I was speaking about how I'm pretty sure that indeed the Pythagoreans would have had to know, because they are not just focused on 10 in terms of this particular triangle, but which is a three-frequency facet eye, if you like, a three-frequency triangle, meaning there's 4 spheres with 3 steps, 3 intervals, hence 3 frequency. And 3 by 3 there's 9 little eyes in here. Because guess what? One can calculate or account for area in eyes very easily. So what we call square numbers is actually triangle numbers. 3 by 3 is 9 little eyes between these spheres. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Count for yourself if you won't believe me. So I would say that they clearly the Pythagoreans were really in love with numbers, and they loved particularly 1 because that's the whole. They loved 2 because it's the relationship. They loved 3 because it is the triad, and it is where number really begins again. It's kind of like the whole cycle where the sphere goes back in on itself with 4, which is why they loved 4 and thought of that as another incarnation of the whole. 10 is the big number for Pythagorean thinking, and that is because they say the Tetractys has 10 spheres, and that's in a triangle. But what happens if we actually add another triangle to our, the way it was translated to us again goes from a sphere to a pair of spheres to a triangle, an eye, to 4 eyes, which is good back at sphere, but a higher frequency, a higher level of complexity of this. A system of its own, a body of its own, binding inside and outside into wholeness. But this is only 4 spheres, we still have 6, and it turns out 6 is another triangle number. See, there is 6 spheres in this one. This is a 2 frequency triangle. There's 2 intervals between 3 spheres along the edge of this. Watch what happens if we add it to the other 4 eyes. It grows a bigger 4 eyes. This is a 2 frequency 4 eyes, and I've gotten this far before when I was talking about the Tetractys, because I was certain that they clearly knew this. If they knew about 10 and about triangles and about 4 eyes, they knew this. And since they had to know this, they also needed to be aware, I am sure, that within this 2 frequency here, we get the next level of fractality in space-time. Because you see, this is a sphere, yes? Now this is a sphere of spheres called the 4 eyes, where we have a gap between the 4 spheres. In this case here, we have a 4 eyes where there is 4 little 4 eyes in it. Here's 1, 4 eyes, 2, 3, 4. I could show you the fingers in another model, but again that would take us too long. This is 4 little 4 eyes around a gap, which is an 8 eyes. Just to show you, the 8 eyes is 6 spheres like this. That's an 8 eyes. 3 spheres sitting on 3 spheres. Now the Pythagoreans would have called that one the octahedron. I call it 8 eyes, or octops if it needs to be Greek. 8 eyes. And they had to know that this was there. So they already knew about the complementarity of space-time that comes with, just as we have, if we unfold a triangle, we have a pair of eyes. We have 2 triangles looking 2 ways. Same way, they complement one another to make the whole, just as the inside and outside, just as the pair of spheres that has a center of gravity between them, just as, again and again, synergy happens to come into being through the spheres. And at the level of the volume itself, there's a complementarity between the 4 eyes and the 8 eyes, because together they can just grow outwards in the same pattern, anywhere, everywhere, the same pattern, without losing symmetry. It's a dozen around spheres. There's a lot to talk about that. It's the isotropic vector matrix, at the heart of synergetics and space-time. And that's this stuff. So knowing that there is the 8 eyes in the middle of this, between the 4 eyes, goes a long way of knowing a lot about the reality of space-time, not not the abstractions of space and time, of cubes without triangulation and so forth, and a linear time nonsense. This is actual space-time, just so. And this is, you know, I'm not speaking metaphorically here. I'm sitting in an 8-eyes, surrounded by these structures, hanging from a structure that is, you know, we're hanging on this together right now, and it's basically an 8-eyes. It's the same shapes, the same structures in various ways of incarnation. But since I'm running both out of time and out of battery here on the phone, let me just finish with the last step that I had added yesterday, which was such an eye-opener, if you allow the pun. Because I said I took it already to this place where it's 3 levels of the IVM, and we have the 2-frequency 4-eyes, and we have the 8-eyes, 4-eyes complementarity. But then I thought, what happens if we add the 4th layer, which is actually our Tetractys that we began with? It's that big triangle. And all of a sudden we got to 4 layers of space-time, 4 layers of IVM, which is to say that at the heart of every one of these facet eyes, there's a one. See, we can look at one of those facets here as 3 spheres in the corners, around 6, around 1. So that's 10 altogether. It's 6 and 4, it's 3 around 6, around 1. It's 10. And now we have this on every side of this, and we have basically the 3-frequency of the 4-eyes here, which has a lot more complexity in it, and it embraces and contains the next layer of complexity of the fractals of spacetime, of spherical spacetime, insofar as within this there actually now exists in the heart of it a little 4-eyes that is going the other way around, an inverse of the first one that we began with, which is the next level of complementarity, because it's not just 4-eyes and 8-eyes, there's 2 directions to the 4-eyes, which are both embodied in the 8-eyes, by the way. But this is, I think this necessarily is where, at least to this point, the Pythagoreans would know about this, because it's absolutely clear how these belong to one another. This is now 4 layers of space-time. They love the number 4. It's 10 spheres on every face here, every facet eye, which they love the 10. They love the Tetractys, clearly, so they would love this. They would know about the complementarities involved, about the breaks of symmetry that we can play with here. There's a whole lot of actual embodied synergetic knowledge within just this, and altogether this is 1,008 spheres, which is to say 2 times 10. This is 10, and this is 10. And in Synergetics we know unity is plural, and at minimum 2, just as inside and outside become one universe. 2 spheres have 1 center of gravity in their line of relationship, and so forth. Unity is plural at minimum 2. This is 2 times the unit of 10. You know, there's 10 spheres here and 10 spheres here. 2 times unity integrated into another whole that has a whole lot more to tell us. And again, if anyone wanted to, I could go into depth and show all the vector relationships within these structures. I've got all the models, and if I don't, I can grow more. If you need any, let me know, I can grow on demand. But that was a deeper look into the Tetractys, into the Pythagoreanism, and their, I think, deeply embodied sense of animate geometry that is equivalent to what came back to us through Bucky Fuller in Synergetics. And that's where I'm going to leave it. And I'm happy to have shared the time space with you, to have had your attention, and I hope to see you again sometime soon, here or there, in the one side or the other of the whole. So peace and take care and be well.